The Bosnian War in the early 1990s was, at the time, the bloodiest conflict on European soil since World War II. Some 100,000 people were killed and more than 2 million were displaced amid widespread ethnic cleansing and massacres. These have since been widely recognized as genocide.
It soon became clear that the Serbs had slaughtered thousands of Bosnian men and buried them in mass graves.
The war began after the breakup of Yugoslavia. Nationalist leaders in neighboring Serbia and Croatia sought to expand their borders by carving up multi-ethnic Bosnia. NATO used force for the first time in its history in Bosnia in 1994. Its air campaign against Bosnian Serbs eventually shifted the momentum of the war, and U.S. diplomacy brought it to an end. The warring parties struck a power-sharing deal in negotiations just outside Dayton, Ohio.
About an hour ago, I spoke with Secretary Christopher in Dayton, Ohio,
in what came to be known as the Dayton Accords.
He informed me that the presidents of Bosnia, Croatia, and Serbia have reached a peace agreement to end the war in Bosnia.
The agreement split Bosnia along sectarian lines. Republika Srpska included the large Serb population, while the Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina mainly consisted of the Croats and Bosnian Muslims, or Bosniaks. But it didn't really resolve the underlying problems. Bosnia continues to be plagued by ethnic division, and the country's political structure is widely seen as ineffective and unstable. These days, Milorad Dodik, the pro-Russian Serbian nationalist leader of Republika Srpska, is trying to secede from the country. Welcome to Season 2 of Counterpoint. Each week, we look at one pressing question facing world leaders from two opposing points of view. I'm Sasha Polako-Saransky, your host and moderator for the show. Today is our season finale, and we're tackling the question, did the Dayton Accords set Bosnia up for failure? Arguing that the Dayton Accords put Bosnia on a path to perpetual crisis is Jasmin Mujanović, a senior non-resident fellow at the New Lines Institute. He's the author of two books, Hunger and Fury, The Crisis of Democracy in the Balkans, and The Bosniaks, Nationhood After Genocide. Welcome, Jasmin.
Thanks for having me.
With us to make the case that the Dayton Accords were essential to bringing peace and maintaining stability is Ambassador Christopher Hill. A career diplomat, Hill was part of the U.S. delegation that brokered the Dayton Agreement. Most recently, he served as the U.S. ambassador to Serbia under President Joe Biden. Thanks for joining us, Chris.
Real pleasure.
Counterpoint is a production of Foreign Policy in partnership with the Doha Forum. Let's get started. Chris, you were the deputy to chief U.S. negotiator Richard Holbrooke. What was Washington's goal in 1995, and what did Dayton achieve in your view?
Well, the Bosnian War had been going on for some 3 years, and with every passing month, there was greater acrimony between the European players who actually had soldiers on the ground in this UN force. The U.S. had declined to take part in the UN force, although the U.S. did subsequently take part in the UN force in what is now North Macedonia. But in any event, the U.S. didn't take part in the UN force in Bosnia because the argument was that it was ineffective, ineffectual. And there was increasing amounts of criticism from Washington, which the Europeans were not taking very well. So I think what was very important in 1995 was in the wake of a situation called in Srebrenica, a small village in which the entire male population thereabouts was murdered. There was an understanding that this situation wasn't getting any better. The transatlantic relationship was fraying, and talk about Europe whole and free and all of the notions of international justice and international values was looking rather weak at that point. So the U.S. decided to leap in with a ferocious, fearsome diplomat named Richard Holbrooke. And so from then on, the U.S. was very much engaged. And it was a tough agreement, obviously. And a lot of people feel that it set Bosnia on the wrong direction. My own feeling is it set Bosnia up for a peaceful future, and that at a certain point, it was up to the people living there. So there's a certain amount that the international community can do, and then the rest is up to the people who live there.
Yasmin, do you think that the Dayton Accords got anything right?
Well, I mean, I think they got something very critical, right, which is something that Ambassador Hill already alluded to, which is peace. And especially after the nature of everything that we had seen in Bosnia up until that point, genocide, systematic crimes against humanity, rape camps, concentration camps, the worst atrocities in Europe since the Holocaust. Obviously, peace was an end in its own right. However, there's at least two Daytons that we need to talk about. One is Dayton as a peace agreement, in which it is doubtlessly the most successful peace agreement in modern political history. But then there's also Dayton as Annex 4, which is the Constitution of Bosnia-Herzegovina. And I think that is where we see the shortcomings, that is where we see the dysfunction, and that is where we see sort of the irrationality at the end of the day of at least the sort of Dayton constitutional order, as some scholars have begun to call it. We could also add a third dimension, which is that, of course, that Dayton, as is often forgotten, was obviously a multi-party agreement. So obviously, first and foremost, it concerned Bosnia-Herzegovina, what was at the time the Republic of Bosnia-Herzegovina, but it also included and had, the signatures, the participation of the Republic of Croatia and what was then referred to as the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, which is now Serbia. And I think one of the sort of ongoing failures is that the various parties that were sort of observers to the agreement, such as the United States, France, and others, its ostensible guarantors, I think they have very much looked the other way on what have at this point become very systematic violations of the Dayton Agreement, or rather their commitments under the Dayton Agreement by governments in Zagreb and first and foremost in Belgrade.
Chris, when you were in Dayton negotiating, did you foresee, and did the U.S. team foresee some of these issues arising down the road?
Well, it's important to understand that our role was as mediators. What we ended up doing was to find areas of agreement where all parties could live with that. I must say, one of the ironies of Dayton was the fact that these constitutional arrangements, which were very much driven by the parties, I mean, we insisted on what Holbrooke used to call the roof over Bosnia. That is, you would have one state. But all of the other issues involving at the entity level, the Serbian Republic questions, the federation questions, those were essentially agreed or pushed by the parties. But the idea of turning Bosnia into two main entities, we thought that the real problem would be that as soon as that was done, they would start putting up checkpoints along the way, and you would essentially have two very different states. And so we were very concerned about freedom of movement. We didn't want a situation where you couldn't move from Sarajevo to Banja Luka without going through various checkpoints. It turned out, actually, that the real problem in Bosnia is the problem of the Constitution rather than the problem of two entities trying to become two states.
So let's get into this a little bit more, the issue of a multinational construction in Dayton. I mean, was the goal of that, Chris, to protect minority rights when it was designed?
The goal, again, you cannot stress this enough, was to end this war. And it was a brutal war. And so we wanted to end that as soon as we could. I think one of the interesting things we did was to kind of create a momentum for peace so that by the time we got around to a ceasefire, the ceasefire held because everyone knew what was going to follow. What we did in 1995, once there was a ceasefire, it held because everyone knew that was going to be the future. And no one, well, some people don't mind risking their lives to be the first casualty of a war. No one wants to be the last casualty of a war.
Yasmin, tell us a little bit more about your critique of Dayton's design and specifically how it may have laid the groundwork for some of the sectarianism we see today.
Well, I mean, first and foremost, I think it's important to recognize that the period between not just 1992 and 1995, but of course, the preceding conflicts in Croatia and also even the brief war in Slovenia really marked a, I think, catastrophic failure on the part of political West at the time. I mean, first and foremost, what is now the European Union. It was a moment in which, as one particular European official put it at the time, right, this was going to be the hour of Europe. And instead, what we saw was inability by Europe and ultimately reluctant involvement by the United States to get involved in this situation. From day one, you had a series of peace proposals made to Bosnia-Herzegovina and to the various sort of proxy forces of Croatia and Serbia within Bosnia-Herzegovina, all of which fundamentally accepted as their starting point the idea of some degree, essentially, of ethnic or sectarian partition and division. And what that ultimately ends up being is what one scholar called a blueprint for ethnic cleansing. And by the time you get to, Dayton, you're really just seeing one more rehash of ideas that had essentially been proposed more or less continuously since 1991 or 1992. And so what it boils down to, I think, from my perspective, and I would say arguably, I'm sitting in Sarajevo right now, a lot of the folks here, you'll get this sense that never really was there a commitment to genuinely defending multi-ethnic secular life in BIH in line with what today still ostensibly continues to be what the EU and the US want to see in this country, which is to say, a country that's going to be incorporated into the European Union, into NATO, in alignment with the European Convention of Human Rights, in alignment with the EU acquis, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Never really did we see a thoroughgoing commitment to realizing that on the ground and speaking clearly to the necessity of those values, especially, again, to leaders in Belgrade and Zagreb at the time, both at the time and since.
Just a quick note here. BIH is shorthand for Bosnia and Herzegovina. Chris, did this come up in your discussions with Holbrooke and others in the U.S. team? Was there a fear that partition would become entrenched? And did the U.S. team at any stage try to sort of push for a multi-ethnic state, or was that just considered impossible?
Well, of course it came up. It came up all the time. I mean, the understanding was that Bosnia was somewhat different from the other republics in Yugoslavia, because Bosnia had different communities living there for centuries. And we were in a very nationalistic, ethno-nationalistic period of history. So we were very concerned that we'd have a situation, for example, where Sarajevo would be divided into sections. And we were thinking just a couple of years before that, we had a situation where Berlin was finally united. And then, along comes another divided city. So we're very aware of that. The issue of you had this brutal ethnic cleansing in eastern Bosnia where Muslims in towns in eastern Bosnia were unceremoniously moved out and many murdered in the process. So we certainly were very aware of the need to create the right of return, for lack of a better term. It's a Middle Eastern term for the Palestinians, but right of return was a concept that you would eventually have people coming back and having their rights to regain their homes and farms. We also were guided as we got into Dayton by the principle that we didn't want a lot of population shifts. So when the Federation armies, that is the Bosniak, who were then, by the way, called Bosnian Muslims. I mean, it's always that population is always referred today as Bosniak. But at the time, Bosnian Muslims and the Croats essentially pushed the Serbs out of places in western Bosnia and looked like they could take Banja Luka, which had a heavy Serbian population. So we were very concerned that if that happened, Serbs did not want to live under a Bosniak or Croatian rule. And again, there was a real sense that we could be heading to partition, and we didn't want that. So we essentially discouraged any further land acquisition. And we also held to something that was called from a couple of years before in the contact group, the idea that the land division would be 51-49, 49% being the Serbian and 51 being the Federation. So in a way, Dayton was a implementation of the contact group plan. The problem was the contact group plan was done in the context of Serbia having the Serbs having some 70% of the territory, And by the time of the summer of 95, you had a very successful effort by the Croats to push out the Serb population in Knin. But you also had a very successful operation in the Livno Valley, where many Serbs were removed from Western Bosnia. So this was going on all the time, and the issue was how to stop it. And once you stopped it, how to avoid a situation where you start moving populations in the way that Stalin ruthlessly did toward the end of World War II.
You're listening to Counterpoint. I'm Sasha Polako-Saransky. We'll be right back. Before we go back to the debate, I thought we should just mention who Dodik is again, if you're not closely following Bosnian politics. As we mentioned at the top, Milorad Dodik is the pro-Russian Serbian nationalist leader of Republika Srpska. He's trying to secede from Bosnia and Herzegovina. They're going to talk about Dodik a lot. Okay, let's get back to the debate. Let's move to the present now. Jasmin, do you think that Dayton can be fixed in a way that would allow the necessary reforms Bosnia needs to take place? Or do you think it needs to be replaced entirely?
Well, I think there's two things. One, actually, I think it's important to go back a little bit to what Ambassador Hill was just saying a moment ago, which is the U.S. decides in that middle to end of 1995 that it is going to stick by what we just referred to as the contact group plan. It does not apply a similar policy to Croatia, right? So it allows the Croatian government to liberate the entirety of its territory, to collapse the self-declared breakaway territory, which is to say actually functionally occupied by Belgrade, what was known as the Republika Srpska Krajina. It allows the Croatian army, with the assistance of the Bosnian army actually as well, coming out of Bihać, to break the hold of the Serbian occupation forces in Croatia. It does not apply the same policy in Bosnia-Herzegovina, and it ultimately ends up functionally protecting what is now the Republika Srpska entity. And I say protecting because Holbrooke, in his own memoirs and in subsequent biographies, is very clear about the fact that towards the end of the negotiations, he told the Bosnian leadership at the time that the U.S. was prepared to militarily intervene against the Bosnian government if it decided to pursue the liberation of Banja Luka, which he then subsequently also admits actually was not true, but it was something that he was that he was saying.
He said a lot of things that weren't quite on point when you're sitting at a table and looking over at Izetbegović and trying to get him to not get a unitary republic by arms. So Holbrooke would say things like, we'll never support this. I remember looking at him and wondering, is that true?
Sure, yeah. But what I'm saying is that that policy was not applied to Zagreb, right? So Zagreb was allowed to liberate the entirety of its territory and to incorporate the Serbian populace into Croatia proper. This was not a privilege, essentially, that was afforded to the government in Sarajevo. Now, in terms of what we want to do, or, what is the ideal outcome of Dayton today, I think there's two things. Again, I mean, there are some very, very obvious structural failures with the constitutional regime in Bosnia-Herzegovina. We are witnessing it right now in this country, right? I mean, we're in the midst of the most serious protracted political crisis since Dayton itself. We have an ongoing attempt at secession and a very serious security debate playing out between both the security organs of the Bosnian state and the small local European peacekeeping force, EUFOR, as to whether or not they can individually or collectively go ahead and arrest this secessionist leader, Milorad Dodik, who has an outstanding warrant by the court of Bosnia-Herzegovina against him. What will be the role of the European Union? What will be the role of NATO, et cetera, et cetera. So in one sense, I think we are already witnessing presently a very, very obvious indication of failure on the part of the Dayton constitutional regime. But I think there certainly is the possibility for some fairly thoroughgoing structural reforms that would at the very least increase functionality in the Bosnian state. And I think it's also important to emphasize that right now, actually, it's very clear that there is a constituency for these changes. I mean, not only among the self-declared Bosniak parties and the self-declared Bosnian, which is to say kind of like multi-ethnic political parties, but actually, very interestingly, the primary ethnic Serb opposition parties in the RS are sending very strong signals that they want to negotiate about the sort of structural arrangements in Bosnia-Herzegovina and that they are actually willing to be quite constructive. The problem at this point actually is pretty much the same problem that we had throughout the Bosnian War, which is that you have two hardline nationalist leaders, one Mr. Dodik himself and the other his closest political ally, Dragan Čović, who's the leader of the main Bosnian Croat nationalist party, the HDZ, which is the sister party of the governing party in Zagreb. And they have at their back the governments of Serbia and Croatia. And so the issue is that, in a sense, Bosnia, because of its institutional arrangements, does not have an equity in power in terms of how it can deal with Zagreb and Belgrade, respectively. And at the same time, it also doesn't have the international support, either from the EU or the US, to be able to say to leaders in Zagreb and Belgrade that we know what you're doing, we see what you're doing, it needs to stop, and Bosnia-Herzegovina needs to be allowed to go through a process of genuine reform on its own terms and the terms of its own citizens.
I think the real problem is people don't talk to each other. There's no process in Sarajevo where you can really get issues rather than ethnicity as the driving principle. So yes, there are things that could have been done in terms of the constitutional structure. What is really discouraging, of course, is that I think if you look at the entirety of Dayton, the Bosnian Serbs did okay. After all, they got a territory, 49%. I mean, albeit a lot of it is unfarmable and uninhabitable, but they got 49% of the country. They got an entire system in Banja Luka, and yet Dodik continues to act like the most trod upon victim in the world. It's outrageous, frankly, the way he is. If you take the logical extreme of what Dodik is looking for, which is independence, Belgrade has made very clear they have no interest in taking the part of Serbian Republic into the current Serbian state. So they constantly support Dayton and say they support not only the territorial integrity of the entities in Bosnia, but also the territorial integrity of Bosnia itself. So the real issue, it's an old dynamic among Serbs, which is Dodik is trying to marshal Serb nationalism and saying that Vučić and the leadership in Belgrade is not doing enough for Serb interests in Bosnia, and constantly putting them under pressure from the right wing to do more. And it's not a very nice process to see going. And I think appropriately, the international community has reacted very severely against Dodik. But I think what really needs to happen is an internal process of dialogue. And to try to end this process, frankly, you go back to the Congress of Berlin in 1878, where the various Balkan parties, well, one thing they learned there is don't talk to each other. Find some great power, as the international community was known in 1878, and make sure that great power becomes your padre and takes care of you. They need to talk to each other, and there needs to be much more of an understanding. They can either swim together or they can sink together.
I have to say, I do think that it's not correct or fair to say that on the part of certainly the Serbian government that we have any kind of meaningful commitment to the territorial integrity of Bosnia-Herzegovina. I mean, Milorad Dodik would be literally a nobody if it was not for Aleksandar Vučić and Belgrade, from now very routine joint sessions of their governments to the very controversial recent so-called all-Serb assembly, which, was this kind of ceremonial list of increasingly more delusional Serb nationalist hobby horses against Bosnia, against Kosovo, against Montenegro, even North Macedonia. And then on the Croatian side, having had actually a fair bit of experience dealing with my friends in the foreign ministry in Zagreb, I would gently suggest to you that I don't think that Croatia has a foreign policy outside of Bosnia-Herzegovina. I mean, there's such a systematic interference in Bosnia's internal affairs by Croatia that at times it's almost in the excess of what we see from Serbia. And I mean, the most obvious way to observe that is what happened here some 2.5 years ago during the October 2022 general elections, where largely at the behest of the Croatian government, the High Representative of Bosnia-Herzegovina not just intervened in the electoral process, but literally as votes were being counted during the 2022 general elections, intervened in such a way that he actually changed the methodology by which those votes were being counted. The only government that explicitly, categorically endorsed that decision, although it was supported by the US, was the Croatian government. And that was, of course, exclusively at the benefit of, again, as I said, their proxy party here in Bosnia, the HDZ. And again, in violation of rulings by the European Court of Human Rights, the Bosnian Constitutional Court. The Bosnian Constitutional Court has in the interim essentially come in and said what the High Representative did in October 2022 was not in keeping with Bosnian jurisprudence. So ultimately then what that means is that does the international community have the intestinal fortitude to deal with another major security crisis in BiH? If it does not want to see that, then it needs to send much, much stronger signals, not just to authorities in Sarajevo, but also to authorities in Belgrade and Zagreb to say, this will not happen. If you're not willing to really enforce your principles of liberal accountability, representative democracy, et cetera, then people like Čović and Dodik are going to continuously sort of pull the string of the sweater and concoct one crisis after another.
Chris, do you think, as Jasmin put it, that the international community has the intestinal fortitude to stand up to Dodik and others like him? And what would that look like?
No, it doesn't. And I think it's a function of the fact that this is not 1992 or 1995. This is a very different era where there are tremendous strains in the North Atlantic relationship today. And there's a full-blown war going on in Ukraine. The attention is just not on Bosnia. And certainly there does not seem to be any stomach or, as you put it, intestinal fortitude to consider sending troops in. In the case of Serbia, I mean, I just spent 3 years trying to get the Serbs to do more about Dodik. They have cut off some of his bank accounts. That was serious stuff. They've also made very clear they don't support secession, but at the same time, he's invited to Belgrade whenever he wants to be there. In fact, he even seated himself at a lunch with Xi Jinping, although he was not invited to do so. So Serbian leadership in Belgrade has to be careful that he doesn't outflank him on the right. And I might mention one other thing that hasn't been talked about very much, which is in the 90s, overlaying all of this was the notion that at some point, this country, in fact, all the other countries in the region, would become members of the European Union. Well, that may be still in the offing, but it's a very long-term process. And in the meantime, we have a Hungary, Budapest, which has been very supportive of Dodik, which has facilitated a lot of things that he's tried to do, including deal with his cash shortages. And behind Hungary, we have Russia that is up to no good at all and has been much closer to Dodik than it has to Serbia itself. So I would like to see a much more realistic concept that the future of these countries needs to be in the European Union. Needless to say, the counterexample of that is, well, we don't want more Hungaries in the European Union. So I'm respectful of the Europeans who tread carefully on the issue of bringing in more members. But, like a lot of things in diplomacy, you simply have to look at what's the alternative.
Jasmin, looking at this from Sarajevo, how does the prospect of EU accession look right now? And do you think that would solve some of the major problems that you've brought up today?
I mean, look, if public opinion polling is to be believed, something almost like 80% of the Bosnian populace is very much in favor of EU membership. You also have actually very strong polling indicating similarly very strong support for NATO membership. And I mean, ultimately, to my mind, NATO membership would be far and away more transformative for Bosnia-Herzegovina's political purposes from a realpolitik standpoint than EU membership. And actually, again, as I said, the public polling suggests that a significant portion of the Serb populace in Bosnia also supports NATO membership. So if the public is to be believed, things are looking great. But at the same time, you then look at the identical polling that says, do you actually believe Bosnia is going to join the EU? Do you believe that the Europeans are serious about their offers for membership for BiH? Then you start seeing pretty abysmal returns. And what that speaks to is not actually opposition to EU membership. I think that speaks to is a profound sense of disillusionment on the part of the Bosnian public, but also other publics in the Western Balkans with the very ineffectual and I think oftentimes quite hypocritical approach that the EU has taken to the enlargement agenda. I mean, when Ukraine and Moldova were granted candidacy status by the EU. That took place in a context where Moldova had applied for candidacy only 3 or 4 months earlier. Bosnia-Herzegovina, during that round, was not granted candidacy status, even though it had applied for the same in 2016. It ultimately received that candidacy status a few months later. But you had this very absurd situation where Moldova has fully 18% of its territory under de facto occupation by the Russian Federation, whereas Bosnia has an EU HQ office here in Sarajevo. And, it's a public secret that EU officials and the EU ambassador in Sarajevo is deeply, deeply involved in day-to-day political rigmarole and decision-making and even governance. And so I think very cheekily and sort of meanly, and I wanted to provoke people, began suggesting at some point that if we take the situation at its face, it would seem to suggest that the Russian occupation of Moldova had done a better job of preparing Moldova for EU membership than the EU office in Sarajevo had done with Bosnia, right? So I think actually, in fairness, the ambassador makes a very, very good point, which is that if the EU wanted to, it could take the entirety of the Western Balkans and make them members tomorrow, and it would hardly feel it. You could say, you know what, we're going to give these countries full membership rights, except for voting rights. So you get around sort of the Hungarian problem and you say, okay, you know what, you're going to be in a sort of antechamber for the next 10, 15 years, but we're going to afford you all the other sort of economic and social rights that come with EU membership. That could be done. That would be novel. And I think it would actually help to stabilize the region. Very significantly, from the international perspective, the history of modern Bosnia over the past 30 years is that there has never really been the political will to meaningfully move the needle in this country or in this region. And if you keep pushing the region down on the agenda, down on the agenda, down on the agenda, and ignoring structural problems, you have what we have now, which is that over the past 2 or 3 years, we've started seeing not just really unthinkable things in Bosnia in terms of the breakdown of basic governance and very serious fears about renewed conflict, but also the situation in Kosovo with the paramilitary attacks in Banjska, in Zvečan, et cetera, et cetera. So I think to just kind of wrap it up, what I would say is, at the very least, I think we need a much, much clearer commitment on the part of the EU to state authorities in Sarajevo, state authorities in Pristina to say, okay, you know what, we're with you. We're going to provide you with the kind of solidarity that we provide Ukraine with, because we recognize there actually is a very imminent and immediate danger of renewed conflict. And we're not just going to pretend that this is a neutral process. We see that there are architects of violence and there are those opposing it. And are the ones opposing it the most perfect imaginable allies? No, they're not. But to Ambassador Hill's point, they're certainly preferable to the alternative. And the alternative, obviously, is people like Dodik, like Čović, like Vučić, and others.
Chris, Jasmin's been talking a lot about the EU. Let's shift gears a bit and talk about the US. Do you think that Trump's foreign policy could upset the status quo and make some of these problems in Bosnia and the Western Balkans more broadly even worse?
I'm not sure how to answer that because I don't know really what his policies are. One thing that I think is fair to, raise some concerns about is the idea that Dodik and certainly Orban in Hungary have a sense that the Trump administration is going to be more positive about their outlook than the overall Bosnian state. And I think that's kind of a prospect that could set the clock back in very unhelpful ways. So, it's hard to say. I mean, I just don't know if any of this has much resonance with an administration that has made it very clear that its objectives are to have sort of a transactional improvement in the U.S. economy, which obviously is causing that, and immigration is taking up just about 100% of their time.
Jasmin, you were a vocal critic of the Biden administration's tactics in the region, but also a bit wary that Republicans might not do any better. What do you think of the future of U.S. support in the region? And do you think there will be any under Trump?
I think to Ambassador Hill's point, I don't expect that the Western Balkans are going to be a priority for this administration. And perhaps looking at the grander picture, the best possible outcome would be for the Western Balkans simply not to become an issue for the Trump administration over the next 4 years. Perhaps that is, the best possible news. It really boils down to the idea that if we're going to talk about Bosnia, we have to talk about Bosnia. meaning we don't talk to Belgrade and Zagreb, we talk to Sarajevo, and we make decisions based on the views of the relevant parties in Bosnia. And likewise, if we're talking about Kosovo, we talk to folks in Kosovo. I think if we continue to treat these countries like some kind of veritable condominiums between Croatia and Serbia in the case of Bosnia, then you're really just replicating the problem. And if anything, sort of, I think, feeding into some of the worst kind of ideological pretensions, again, of people like Aleksandar Vučić, Andrej Plenković, and all of these other folks who I think have, as I said, had a very, very malign agenda in BiH, in Kosovo, and elsewhere.
So we're going to have to stop it there for today. I'd like to thank both of my guests, former U.S. Ambassador Chris Hill. Thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you. It's been a real pleasure.
And Jasmin Mujanović, a senior non-resident fellow at the New Lines Institute. Thanks for coming.
Thank you very much. This was great.
Counterpoint is a production of Foreign Policy in partnership with the Doha Forum. Our production staff includes Rob Sachs, Laura Rossbrow-Tellem, and Dan Efron, with special thanks to Sarah Hahn, Claire Schnatterbeck, and Claudia Tatey. I'm Sasha Polako-Saransky. Thanks for listening.